Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're all well. It's Thursday afternoon, it's just before 12:30, and today's assembly I want to do two things. The first is tell you about next week's theme, which actually starts tomorrow. I've got a bit of a challenge for you to start tomorrow. And then, of course, we shall finish the chapter of Winnie the Pooh that involves Pooh and Piglet trying to catch a heffalump. So, the theme for the coming week. Well, next week is National Refugee Week. It's an appreciation of all the wonderful things that a variety of refugees over a period of time have brought to our country. It's something that Mrs. John put me on to at the start of this week. And something that I didn't realise was that actually in this region, in Cambridgeshire and Norfolk particularly, during the late 1930s, during the Spanish Civil War, this region took lots of children as refugees from the Spanish Civil War. And tomorrow, Friday, there is what's called a day of welcome that the Norfolk Sanctuary Schools and Anglia Ruskin University are organising. And on our website there's a bit of information about what happened during that period, how those children were looked after in Cambridgeshire and in Norfolk, and also a couple of activities that you can get involved in that I would love to see photos of. So there is a word of welcome where you can create a poster, a welcome sign that we would put up for people that are coming to come and see us, coming to come and join our community, whether they're refugees or not. So there's a word of welcome, and also there is a hexagon of hope, and the hexagons are on the website. You can create some artwork using those hexagons, and then what we'll do is we'll take all those back. If you can email them, get your parents, your carers to email those pictures, the things that you've done to us. Mrs. John's then going to collate them because the Anglia Ruskin University are going to create a big piece of digital artwork based on some of the smaller pieces of artwork that some of the schools have been involved in. There's also, on a letter that I'm sending home today and on our website, a link to the National Refugee Week website as well, where you can learn a bit more about refugees in general and the importance of National Refugee Week, and appreciating and recognising all the wonderful things that the people that have taken refuge in our country, that we've looked after, bring to our communities. So I think it's a really interesting thing. I got completely engaged and drawn into what was happening in the Spanish Civil War at the time, and why the children were coming to Cambridge and what happened when they got here. I found it incredibly interesting. I think lots of you will find it interesting. And actually, I think that idea of welcoming people from places where times are extremely challenging and welcoming them into a community and looking after them is something that just sits so nicely with our Willingham values and ethos around kindness, integrity and hard work, that I felt it was a really good thing to do. Mrs. John, as I say, put me onto it, and I think it's really important that we recognise that National Refugee Week next week. The children in school are going to be doing some of those activities for the Day of Welcome tomorrow, and I thought it would be a nice thing for perhaps you to do at home as well. So that was number one, introducing next week's theme. Number two is to finish the story of Pooh trying to find a heffalump. So if you remember, they had just had a debate about whether or not heffalumps like acorns or whether they like honey. And Pooh had just decided actually maybe they liked acorns. Piglet had decided maybe they liked honey. Honey, said Piglet to himself in a thoughtful way, as if it were now settled. I'll dig the pit while you go and get the honey. Oh, very well, said Pooh, and he stomped off. As soon as he got home, he went to the larder and he stood on a chair and took down a very large jar of honey from the top shelf. It had Hunny, honey, written on it. But just to make sure, he took the paper cover off and looked at it, and it looked just like honey. But you never can tell, said Pooh. I remember my uncle once saying that he'd seen some cheese just this colour. So he put his tongue in, and he took a large lick. Yes. It's our lunchtime bell, he said, It is. No doubt about that. And honey, I should say, right down to the bottom of the jar. Unless, of course, he said, somebody put cheese in the bottom for a joke. Perhaps I'd better go down a little further, just in case. In case heffalumps don't like cheese. Same as me. Ah! And he gave a deep sigh. I was right. It is honey, right the way down. Having made certain of this, he took the jar of honey back to Piglet, and Piglet looked up from the bottom of his very deep pit and said, Got it? And Pooh said, Yes, but it isn't quite a full jar, and he threw it down to Piglet. And Piglet said, No, it isn't. Is that all you've got left? And Pooh said, Yes, because it was. So Piglet put the jar in the bottom of the pit and climbed out, and they went off home together. Well, good night, Pooh, said Piglet, when they got to Pooh's house. And we meet at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning by the pine tree and see how many heffalumps we've got in our trap. 6 o'clock, Piglet. Have you got any string? No. Why do you want string? To lead them home with. Oh, I think heffalumps come if you whistle. Some do and some don't. You never can tell with heffalumps. Well, good night. Good night. And off Piglet trotted to his house, Trespassers W, while Pooh made his preparations for bed. Some hours later, just as the night was beginning to steal away, Pooh woke suddenly with a sinking feeling. He had had that sinking feeling before, and he knew what it meant. He was hungry. So he went to the larder, and he stood on a chair and reached up to the top shelf and found nothing. That's funny, he thought. I know I had a jar of honey there, a full jar full of honey right to the top, and it had H-U-N-N-Y, honey, written on it, so that I knew it was honey. That's very funny. And then he began to wander up and down, wondering where it was, and murmuring a murmur to himself like this. It's very, very funny, 'cause I know I had some honey, 'cause it's had a label on, say, honey. A galoshes full of pot too. I don't know where it's got to. No, I don't know where it's gone. Well, it's funny. He'd murmured this to himself 3 times in a singing sort of way, when suddenly he remembered he had put it in the cunning trap to catch the heffalump. Bother, said Pooh. It all comes of trying to be kind to heffalumps. And he got back into bed. But he couldn't sleep. The more he tried to sleep, the more he couldn't. He tried counting sheep, which is sometimes a good way of getting to sleep, and as that was no good, he tried counting heffalumps, and that was worse, because every heffalump that he counted was making straight for a pot of Pooh's honey, and eating it all. For some minutes he lay there miserably, but when the 587th heffalump was licking its jaws and saying to itself, Very good honey, this. I don't know when I've tasted better, Pooh could not bear it any longer. He jumped out of bed, he ran out of the house, and he ran straight to the 6 pine trees. The sun was still in bed, but there was a lightness in the sky over the 100-acre wood, which seemed to show that it was waking up and would soon be kicking off its clothes. In the half-light, the pine trees looked cold and lonely, and the very deep pit seemed deeper than it was. And Pooh's jar of honey at the bottom was something mysterious, a shape and no more. But as he got nearer to it, his nose told him that it was indeed honey, and his tongue came out and began to polish up his mouth, ready for it. Bother, said Pooh, as he got his nose inside the jar. A heffalump has been eating it all. And then he thought a little and said, Oh no, I did, I forgot. Indeed, he had eaten most of it, but there was just a little bit left at the very bottom of the jar, and he pushed his head right in and began to lick. By and by, Piglet woke up. As soon as he woke, he said to himself, Oh, and then he said bravely, Yes, and then he said more bravely, Quite sadly. But he didn't feel very brave, for the word which was really jittering about his brain was heffalumps. was a heffalump like? Was it fierce? Did it come when you whistled? And how did it come? Was it fond of pigs at all? If it was fond of pigs, did it make any difference what sort of a pig? Supposing it was fierce with pigs, would it make any difference if the pig had a grandfather called Trespassers William? He didn't know the answer to any of these questions, and he was going to see his first heffalump in about an hour from now. Of course, Pooh would be with him, and it was much more friendly with two, but suppose heffalumps were fierce with pigs and bears? Wouldn't it be better to pretend that he had a headache and couldn't go up to the 6 pine trees this morning? But then, supposing it was a very fine day and there was no heffalump in the trap, here he would be, in bed all morning, simply wasting his time for nothing. What should he do? And then he had a clever idea. He would go up very quietly to the 6 pine trees now, peep very cautiously into the trap and see if there was a heffalump there. And if there was, he would go back to bed, and if there wasn't, he wouldn't. So off he went. At first, he thought there wouldn't be a heffalump in the trap, and then he thought that there would. And as he got nearer, he was sure that there would, because he could hear it heffalumping about like anything. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, oh dear, said Piglet to himself. And he wanted to run away, but somehow, having got so near, he felt that he must just see what a heffalump was like. So he crept to the side of the trap and peered in. And all the time, Winnie the Pooh had been trying to get the honey jar off his head, and the more he shook it, the more tightly it got stuck. "Mother," he said inside the door, "oh, help, and mostly, oh." And he tried bumping it against things, but he couldn't see what he was bumping it against, and it didn't help him, and he tried to climb out of the trap, but as he could see nothing but the jar, and not much of that, he couldn't find his way. So at last he lifted up his head, jar and all, and made a loud roaring noise of sadness and despair. And it was at that moment that Piglet looked down. "Help! Help!" cried Piglet. "A heffalump! Oh, horrible heffalump!" And he scampered off as hard as he could, still crying out, "Help! Help! Horrible heffalump! Oh, horrible, a horrible horror! Oh, horrible lump!" And he didn't stop crying or scampering until he got to Christopher Robin's house. "Whatever's the matter, Piglet?" said Christopher Robin, who was just getting up. "Hare," said Piglet, breathing so hard he could hardly speak. "Hare, a hare, a heffalump." "Where?" "Up there," said Piglet, waving his paw. "What did it look like?" Like it had the biggest head you ever saw, Christopher Robin, and a great enormous thing like nothing, a huge one, big, well, I don't know, like an enormous big nothing, like a jar." "Well," said Christopher Robin, putting on his shoes, "I shall go and take a look at it. Come on." Piglet wasn't afraid if he had Christopher Robin with him, so off they went. "I can hear it, can't you?" said Piglet anxiously as they got near. "I can hear something," said Christopher Robin. It was Pooh, bumping his head against the tree root he'd found. "There," said Piglet. "Isn't it awful?" And he held on tight to Christopher Robin's hand, and suddenly Christopher Robin began to laugh. And laugh, and he laughed, and he laughed, and he was laughed, and while he was still laughing, crash went the heffalump's head against the tree root, smash went the jar, and out came Pooh's head again. Then Piglet saw what a foolish piglet he'd been, and he was so ashamed of himself that he ran straight off home and went to bed with a headache. But Christopher Robin and Pooh went home to breakfast together. "Oh, Bear," said Christopher Robin, "how I do love you." "So do I," said Pooh. Okay, there you are. So 2 things today. Number 1, next week's theme of the week around National Refugee Week. Number 2, that story. I do love the Winnie the Pooh stories. They're fantastic. Apologies for the interruption of the bell, but we're still going on here at school, and it's lunchtime, and we have a staggered lunchtime, and children go out at different times, so the bells ring at slightly different times. And that's it for this week. Hopefully over the next few days you'll be getting access to Teams, which will give you a chance to be able to hand in some work and get some feedback on your work from your teachers, which would be really great. I'm glad that you've all been really enjoying the Zoom meetings that have been going on. More of those over the next week as well. One last thing to say, and that is, of course, at Willingham Primary School, so that we become, and I shall see you all again next.